Good morning, Plum Creek. How are you? Good. It was probably the person I admired most growing up was my Aunt Linda. Now, Aunt Linda was one of these people that, as a teenager, I so admired because she had lived such an adventure, right? She had traveled the whole world, knew all of these important, famous people. I imagine wow, I want to grow up and go to the Taj Mahal, and I want to ride on an elephant. I want to see the world. She just seemed so sophisticated and well-traveled. And so it was a surprise to me when last year we invited her over to our house for Thanksgiving. And she lives in Canyon City, and so she said, Eric, how do I get to your house? And I said, well, here's my address. So I gave her the address. And there was a really long pause. And she said, well, yeah, but how do I get to your house? I was like, well, you take that address and you take out that little computer in your pocket and you punch it in there and it'll tell you how to get to my house. And then there was a really long pause again. She's like, Eric, I don't trust those things. And I said, well, okay. Well, how are you going to get to my house then? She goes, that's what I've been asking you. And so she went on to say, I need you to give me directions. Tell me how to get there. And as I started to tell her how to get to my house, it became really clear to me, I have no idea how to get to my house. I'm like, I don't know what that street's called. I don't know where you turn. I mean, by the end of the conversation, it was pretty clear that neither of us had any idea where we were going. And I was like, well, all right, well, I'll just see you next year then, you know? I was thinking about this whole idea of directions and where we headed. And the truth is, for some of us, have you ever been in spots in your life where you're like, man, I have an idea of where I'm supposed to go. I have no idea how I'm supposed to get there, right? I have a sense of what I'm supposed to do with my life and where I'm supposed to head, but I don't know what the turns are. Chrissy and I did a little getaway this weekend. This week we went down to Glenwood Springs and we were having this conversation about okay, we're getting near the end of child rearing. We're real close to being the end of this. And we looked back to when we started and we both were like, we had no idea what we were doing, right? At 23, you have a kid and it's that. Listen, all of our kids are lucky just to be alive. But I think about this reality, where are we headed? And I don't think it's just about life. I think oftentimes even in our faith, we're like, look, I don't know what following Jesus really is supposed to mean to my life. I know coming to church and I'm supposed to show up and I just don't know what I'm supposed to do with all this. What am I supposed to do? Give me some directions. And if you've ever felt that, you're in good company because the reality is, as followers of Jesus, I think this question gets posed a lot. Well, can you tell me what this is supposed to do? What am I supposed to do with this? You go back to the early disciples, and it's even clear with these guys. After 3 years of following Jesus, they were still asking the same question, still sort of wrestling through, what are we supposed to do with all this? In John chapter 14, it's a very interesting moment in Scripture. Because here are these guys, these young disciples who've been following Jesus for 3 years. And they're now Thursday night. This is Thursday night right after the Passover meal. And you would think after 3 years of following Jesus and listening to him talk, they'd have a really clear direction on what comes next. But it becomes pretty clear that they don't. So Jesus had just told them that he was going to leave. He just had the Passover meal. He sort of shared that someone was going to betray him, that someone was going to deny him. So the disciples are feeling a little bit anxious because they're like, all right, we don't know what to do next. And here's what Jesus says in John chapter 14, verse 1. He says, now don't let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If it weren't so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. And then he says this line. He says, you know the way to the place where I'm going. It's not a question. He's basically saying, look, you've been following me for 3 years. You know the way. And I don't know if you've ever been in a room when someone told a joke that you didn't get. You ever had one of those where you don't want to be the person that goes, I don't understand what that means, but I can promise you that all these disciples hear Jesus say, you know the way, you know the direction, and all of them are like, I do, but could you explain it for someone else so that we could all hear it, And they're confused, they have no idea. And then Thomas, I just love Thomas, in verse 5 just says what everybody else is thinking when he says, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way, right? I love this guy because, side note on Thomas, 3 times in the New Testament, you'll see Thomas Didymus. And Didymus is the Greek for twin. And twin in the ancient world, in that ancient culture, twins were often seen as pretty complicated, unsettling. They complicated inheritance lines. They stirred up all kinds of tensions. You think about Jacob and Esau, right? So twin, to be a Didymus, this is not a good thing. And historians don't know if he was an actual twin. And some actually think that what this writer is trying to describe is not just a biological situation here, but it's actually something in his soul. That there's a twin part of Thomas, right? Where he's a disciple, but he doubts. He's loyal, but he hesitates. He's wants to believe, but he also wants a few guarantees about faith. Does that sound familiar? It feels to me like I'm the most like Thomas, right? Where I'm split between trust and uncertainty and faith and fear and devotion and a little bit of doubt. And so Thomas is like, look, man, Jesus, I don't know where to go. Yes, I've been following you for 3 years, but could you just give me some direction? What am I supposed to do? And I thought a lot about the reality of those first century disciples, these young men who had given up everything to follow Jesus. And if they needed clarity in that moment, then maybe we do too. Because oftentimes when Christians are asked, hey, what does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean? What is this path? Many of us, we're not really sure. In fact, there was a recent survey that just surveyed some Christians and said, what do you think it means to follow Jesus? And many Christians said, well, live good lives and be kind and show some love and maybe go to church and read the Bible and don't swear or cheat or lie or steal, right? But is it more than that? Is there something more to being a disciple? And that's what we're going to explore in the next few minutes. What does it mean? Like, what does it mean to follow Jesus, to give our lives to this person? Now, for us to define this, I think we have to go back in time, and I think we start at the beginning with the word disciple. Now, I don't know what context you grew up in, but depending on that context, you might have a different idea about what disciple and discipleship means. If you grew up in a Christian church at all, you've heard that word. But in the first century, to be a disciple, this was not something that was thrown around lightly. It actually had a very, very specific meaning. If you wanted to be a disciple in the first century, you didn't sign up for a class. You didn't take some online course, right? You didn't just agree with someone's teaching. If you wanted to be a disciple, you actually followed a rabbi. Now, a rabbi in the first century was primarily a recognized teacher of Torah, right? And the Hebrew meaning for the word rabbi actually means my master, my teacher. This was someone who was knowledgeable in Jewish law. They were capable of instructing others. They would oftentimes take on disciples or followers. And if they had a special authority, they were given the ability to interpret Torah. In other words, to pass judgment on Torah. When they did this, it was called a rabbi's yoke. Now, in Scripture, you will see the word yoke used. In fact, Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 says this. He says, take my yoke upon you. And the yoke is his teaching. It's how he understands Torah. Now, to get a yoke, to be able to teach with authority, normally you would come up underneath a rabbi who could teach and interpret Torah and had a yoke. This is why in Jesus' day, you notice that other rabbis challenged Jesus about his authority. And they said, where does your authority come from? Because Jesus would often say like, you've heard it said, but I say. They said, where did your authority come by? Because you didn't follow another famous rabbi. And that's when Jesus says, well, my authority comes from a different place, right? So a yoke is a teaching. It is the way that this rabbi would have understood Torah. And if you were a disciple, you didn't just agree with this yoke. The idea was you took it on to the entirety of your life. You adopted it as a whole way of life. This is why in Luke chapter 6, verse 40, it says this, a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher, his rabbi. If you were a disciple of a rabbi, you walked where he walked, you listened to his voice, you watched how he lived, you ate what he ate, you slept where he slept. In fact, there are ancient stories of disciples wanting so badly to mimic everything about their rabbi that there's stories of them crawling underneath their rabbi's bed to listen to their rabbi sleep, just in case they might miss something. They wanted to soak up everything they could, anything. And this was the level of devotion that a disciple had. It meant full-on commitment. It meant like reshaping your thoughts, your actions, your desires around your teacher, because the goal, again, was simple. Become just like him. And when I think about discipleship today, I think it's important that we understand that the meaning has not changed. Discipleship is us understanding what Jesus said and then taking that on into our lives. Dallas Willard, famous theologian, author, he puts it this way. He says, as disciples, literally students of Jesus, our goal is to learn to be like him. We begin by trusting him to receive us as we are, but our confidence in him leads us toward the kind of faith that he had, a faith that empowered him to act as he did, to be a disciple, to take on Jesus' yoke. And I think if I were to describe the two major components of discipleship, what it means to be a disciple, or how we see it here at Plum Creek, I start with this single thought. First, a disciple is someone who has decided that Jesus is right. A disciple is someone who has decided through time, through some effort, that Jesus is right. That he's right about the nature of God, that he's right about the human condition, that he's right about what makes life good and whole and worth living. And this isn't always easy, right? Because much of what Jesus said is at odds with some of what we've learned to be true about life. But that wrestle isn't anything new. In the first century, to be a disciple, settling that Jesus was right, that didn't come easy either, right? It meant that they were wrestling deeply with everything that they had been taught about God and power and justice and salvation. I mean, you just think about it. Could it really be true that God really would be a father who runs toward a sinner? Because a first century person that would be a mind-blowing idea about God. Is it true? Could it be that the meek really would be blessed? Could loving enemies really lead to freedom? Could the cross really be a throne? These just weren't easy truths. They were upside down. They were inside out. They were utterly disruptive. And yet, over time, as these disciples walked with Jesus, they came to believe. They come to believe, not just intellectually, but existentially. They believed that Jesus speaks the truest words ever spoken. That his teachings are not merely helpful tips to a moral life, but the very structure of reality as it actually is. A disciple is someone who believes Jesus is right, not only about eternity, but about today. That Jesus is right about money, that he's right about fear, that he's right about forgiveness, that he's right about ambition and power and all of it. The disciple has concluded he's right. And because of this, if Jesus is right, really, really right, think about this, then following Jesus is not just a religious devotion. It is the most rational decision that a person can make. Like if Jesus is truly right about all of this, then following him, it makes sense. So if Jesus is right about God, about life, about the soul, then it only makes sense that the second step would happen, that we would rearrange our life around what he says is true. I want you to think about that for a moment. To rearrange your life around what he says is true. I heard this quote recently, and I think it's so true. The quote was that the greatest issue facing the world today is whether those who by profession or culture are identified as Christians will become disciples, students, apprentices, actually living their lives as Jesus would if he were they. Because here's the truth. I think the first part of discipleship, sort of understanding and concluding that Jesus is right, this whole idea of believing in Jesus, and many of us were taught, and this comes easy, to believe. That it's stuff that we think about. But believing in Jesus is not necessarily following him. Somewhere along the way, we started to think that following Jesus is just like agreeing with certain ideas. But you have to understand this. Jesus did not come to inform us. He came to transform us. I was thinking a lot about this because so often when we begin to talk about the way in which we act, because that is what this is about, when we begin to rearrange our lives around the truths of Jesus, there's phrases that get used in Christian context that we need to act like Jesus, right? Act like him. And I grew up with that idea that I needed to act like Jesus. I grew up in the church, and in my context, on Sundays, we went to church 2 times a day. We went in the morning, we went in the evening. I was expected to go to church. And I began to learn along the way, there are certain things that you can do in church, and there's certain things that you cannot do. And I learned one of them the hard way. I was like in 6th grade, and it was an evening service. And so like, you're going to church at night. No, listen, when you're in 6th grade, you're not very excited about that, right? So on the way out the door, back in the day, we had this magazine called Sports Illustrated. And so I grabbed 4 Sports Illustrateds and I took them to church. But I wanted to be a good Christian kid, so I went down and sat on the front row. That's what acting like Jesus did. Sat on the front row, and the preacher, man, he got about halfway into this message, and it was very boring. It was my dad. And so I took out the Sports Illustrated. Gladly, I had it on hand, and I propped my feet up on the pew in front of me, and I started to read that Sports Illustrated. And buddy, my mom moved like the Flash. She came out of nowhere, zipped down the aisle, literally grabbed me by my ear. I thought she ripped it off, and began to drag me down the aisle. The whole church is watching. There was nothing discreet. And she the whole way is like, is this how you act in church? Is this how you act? We get to the back door, and I was like, Mom, I don't understand. Does Jesus not like sports? And she's like, no, he doesn't. There's certain things so oftentimes like, we think about acting like Jesus, and it's all about behavior modification, right? And certainly there are behaviors that are unhealthy that we should look to root out of our lives. Let me be clear that Jesus is not interested in behavior modification. What he is interested in is what Dallas Willard calls a reformation of the heart. That he changes your heart to such an extent that all of this stuff flows out of you. It flows out of you. Our efforts should be directed towards the transformation of our heart. And that means learning to be kind, just as Jesus was kind when he healed the leper in Matthew chapter 8. It means speaking words of life, as Jesus did with the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. It means becoming people of forgiveness, as Jesus did when he met Peter after his denial in John chapter 21. It means showing bravery and defending the vulnerable, as Jesus did when he stood up for the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. Look, if you're a follower of Jesus, you must know this. It's not about acting. It's about becoming. Changing our heart, or rearranging our lives in such a way that we become the person that Jesus thought of when he thought you up. Transformation. But I will tell you that if you do not rearrange your life around those things you believe, you will not become that. And so what does it look like? Well, truthfully, I can't give you all of it in one message. And so over the next few months, we're gonna be unpacking, rearranging our lives around these things that are truths. But I can tell you this, what I will tell you is what I've learned about rearranging my life is that it will affect my schedule. Not in a burdensome obligation, but you do begin to discover, like a quiet joy of starting your day with Jesus. My schedule begins to change when I begin to align myself with his truth. My relationships start to be rearranged because you start to realize that life in the kingdom can't be done alone. You begin to open yourself up to spiritual friendships, to confession, to encouragement. You don't avoid hard conversations. You walk through them with love because Jesus is teaching you to become a peacemaker, not a peacekeeper. Like when you begin to rearrange your life around his truth, it affects your money. And it's no longer off limits to God. You stop asking, how much must I give? And instead you start asking, how much am I being invited to trust? When we decide that Jesus is right and we begin to rearrange our lives, our posture towards the church shifts because we stop thinking that Sunday is a spiritual service you attend. You start to realize you are the church. And slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, when we begin to rearrange our lives around Jesus being right, your whole life begins to take on the shape of Jesus. You wake up one day and you find yourself more patient and less anxious, more grateful, less entitled, more forgiving, less reactive. See, being a disciple here, it's not about perfection. It's not about acting, but it is about determining that Jesus is right and then rearranging our lives around that. Now, of course, it means we have to know what Jesus said. We have to spend time in this book and understand what he said. But I do know this, that in this season, if we take this seriously and honestly, we may not get it perfect, but we will become like our rabbi. Now, I'll tell you, this isn't just a series, because I know some of you are like, cool, this is gonna be a great 4-week series. Truly, Plum Creek, this is a season. In fact, this season has been years in the making. 5 to be exact. Because it was right around COVID that Pastor Doug, because all of us had a bunch of alone time, that Pastor Doug began to think about the future of Plum Creek and where God was calling us and what he saw as the future. And part of what began to boil up in him was that there was something that God was calling us to as a church. There was some sort of depth, some sort of followership that he's calling us to. And at the time, he and I were just friends. And so it was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, that I got a call from Doug, Pastor Doug. And he said, well, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm driving right now. And he's like, no, I mean like with your life. And I'm like, good grief, bro, I'm driving. You know? And what Pastor Doug and I had journeyed, like back in 2007, I started work around spiritual formation. Like I was pretty young in ministry, but I had this deep sense that I wanted to understand, how do we follow Jesus? because we need followers of Jesus, not more churchgoers. We need people who really genuinely see Jesus as their rabbi and in a way that a first century disciple would commit themselves to that. And so started work like 20 years ago, thinking and reading and writing. And so when Pastor Doug called, he said, listen, Eric, there's this season coming for our church, and I just feel it deeply in me that it's a season where it's not just about growing bigger, it's about going deeper. And it's not just about believing in Jesus, but a church that's trying to become like him. A church that's trying to be a church of disciples who live the way of Jesus in real time. And that's when he extended the invitation. And I was thinking about it this week because it was 2 years ago that I really felt like, I know specifically 2 years ago this weekend, because 2 years ago this weekend, they do that parade downtown and all the rodeo. By the way, did you notice I was wearing cowboy boots? I've made it. But 2 years ago, standing out on that street where I'm like, this is where God has called me to be a part of this journey. And he had this very specific vision in mind. And he said, Eric, will you help us chart a path that we could walk together as a church? And I need to be clear, not a class, not a program. I don't know what your familiarity with discipleship is. We're talking about a way of life that we invite all of us into to walk together. And that's what we're stepping into now as a church. Learning what Jesus said and then slowly and honestly rearranging our lives around what he says is true. And it won't be perfect. That's not the expectation. And if for some of you, you're like, man, I'm brand new here. Slow down, bro. I don't even know who Jesus is. It's cool. This is a journey. You're in good company. I mean, here these dudes following around for 3 years and they still didn't know what he was talking about. We're going to walk through this together as a community. But we are going to walk toward what Jesus asks us to do. And on your way out, you might notice that there's kind of 4 blue panels against this wall. And those just got put up this week. And maybe as you're walking by, you might look at them because over the last 12 months, we've been wrestling. Like, how do we define rearranging our lives? What do we have to rearrange our lives to as a community to align with what Jesus said? And you'll see them up on the wall, and some of them you're kind of familiar with, and some of them are new, but we'll call them values or pathways or whatever it is you want to call them, but this is what we rearrange our life to, that we're going to live as contributors because God has placed something beautiful in you to build in others. We're going to live life together because I'll tell you this, isolation is a terrible teacher. And we're going to live irrationally generous because Jesus said, our hearts follow our treasure. And ultimately, we're going to live like Jesus. Not perfectly, but increasingly. Not just on Sundays and not just in moments of inspiration, but in our habits and in our homes and in our real lives. And so I'll give you the quote that Pastor Doug gave me. So Plum Creek, buckle up. Because over the next few months and next few years, we're going to walk through what it actually means, one step at a time. And we're going to do it together to learn what he said. My greatest hope is that when we're said and done, and all of us are going to stand before the Lord one day, right? That he says, well done. You didn't do it perfectly, but you tried to follow me well. And I want that to be said of us. And so will you stand with me? I want to read something to you. And you might hear us say this over and over, but I want to read this with conviction because it is the conviction, this journey of following Jesus we're going to embark on. And this is what we believe, that Jesus is the only one with the authoritative wisdom on how to live. And he is the only one who can forgive you of your sins. He's the only one who gives real hope for conquering death. And to all who come to him, he is the thirst quencher, the life giver, and the Spirit bringer. And no matter where you've been and how far you've run, if you're ready to listen and obey, there is a new life for you as a follower of his. And so, Plum Creek, let's follow Jesus well together. Amen.